The massive Zephyrian fleet appeared at the edge of Earth's solar system without warning. Their ships looked like floating crystals made of dark metal, each one larger than a city. Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the small blue planet through the viewing screen. His four eyes gleamed with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. "Another primitive world," he said to his second-in-command. "They barely have space travel. This should take less than an hour." The Zephyrian Galactic Empire had been expanding for over 300 years. They ruled 12 star systems and controlled dozens of different alien species. Their method was simple and effective. They would arrive at a new world, show their superior technology, and give the locals a choice: become part of the empire or be destroyed. Most species chose to live. Kethvar had done this dance 43 times before. The pattern never changed. First came fear when the local population saw the Imperial fleet. Then came desperate attempts to negotiate. Finally came acceptance when they realized they had no chance of winning a fight. "Send the standard ultimatum," Kethvar ordered. The message reached Earth within minutes. Every government received the same transmission. The alien's voice was cold and mechanical as it spoke through translation devices. "Inhabitants of the third planet, you have been selected for incorporation into the Zephyrian Galactic Empire. You will provide tribute in the form of resources and population. Your military forces will be disbanded. Your governments will be replaced by imperial administrators. You have 72 Earth hours to accept these terms. Refusal will result in the complete sterilization of your world." In the United Nations building in New York, emergency sessions began immediately. World leaders gathered through video calls and holographic projectors. The debate was intense but short. Everyone had seen the footage from the outer system. The alien ships were real and they were huge. President Chen of the Global Defense Council looked tired as she addressed the emergency assembly. "We've all seen the analysis from our best scientists. Their technology is at least 200 years ahead of ours. Their smallest ship could destroy our largest city. We cannot win a direct military confrontation." The British Prime Minister leaned forward. "Then what choice do we have? We've seen what happened to other worlds that refused. The Scori homeworld is nothing but radioactive ash now. The Australian colonies on Kepler 442 tried to hide in underground bunkers," added the German Chancellor. "The Imperial forces found them anyway. Every single person was killed or taken as slaves. Around the table, faces showed the same mix of fear and anger. They all knew the stories. The Zephyrian Empire didn't make empty threats. When they said they would destroy a world, they meant it. But then something unexpected happened." General Patricia Okafor, head of Earth's Combined Military Command, stood up. She was a tall woman with scars from the water wars of 2089. Her voice was calm but firm. "I've been studying Imperial expansion patterns for 15 years, she said. "I've read every report from refugees and survivors. I know exactly what happens to species that surrender to them." She activated a holographic display showing dozens of alien worlds. The Nethril were an aquatic species with beautiful underwater cities. After they surrendered, the Empire drained their oceans for mineral extraction. 90% of their population died within 5 years. The display changed to show insectoid creatures. The Hivari were master engineers who built incredible hive cities. The Empire used them as slave labor to build warships. They're worked to death in Imperial factories. More images flashed by. Each one showed the same story. Species that had once been proud and free, reduced to nothing more than resources for the Empire to exploit. "The choice isn't between death and survival," Okafor continued. "It's between dying free or dying as slaves. At least if we fight, some of our children might escape to the outer colonies." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what she was saying, but nobody wanted to speak the words out loud. Finally, President Chen asked the question that hung in the air. "Are you suggesting we refuse their ultimatum?" "I'm suggesting we've been looking at this wrong," Okafor replied. "We keep thinking about this as a military problem, but it's not. It's a human problem, and humans have never been good at following orders from bullies." She pulled up another display, this one showing Earth's history. Images of various wars and conflicts scrolled past. "We're not the strongest species in the galaxy. We're not the smartest or the most advanced. But we have something the Empire has never faced before." "What's that?" asked the Japanese representative. Okafor smiled for the first time since the aliens had arrived. "We're really good at making powerful enemies regret messing with us. The Zephyrians think this is about technology and firepower. They don't understand that human warfare isn't just about winning battles. It's about making the other side wish they'd never started the fight in the first place. The debate continued for hours, but something had changed in the room. Fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else now, something that felt almost like hope. When President Chen called for the final vote, the result surprised even her. 193 votes to refuse the ultimatum. 0 votes to surrender. No abstentions. The response was transmitted exactly 72 hours after the original ultimatum. Admiral Kethvar expected to receive notification of surrender, as always happened. Instead, he got a message consisting of a single word from President Chen. No. Kethvar stared at the transmission for several seconds. His 4 eyes blinked in confusion. No? What do they mean, no? This is not how the protocol works. Sir, his communications officer said nervously. Perhaps they don't understand the consequences of refusal. Send them recordings of what happened to the last 3 worlds that refused, Kethvar ordered. Show them the destruction of Scori Prime. Show them the orbital bombardment of the Kellen system. Make sure they understand what happens to species that defy the Empire. The recordings were transmitted to Earth immediately. Every human government received videos of planets being reduced to burning wastelands, cities vaporized by energy weapons, populations fleeing in terror as Imperial forces landed. Earth's response came back within an hour. Again, it was from President Chen. Again, it was one word. No. This time, Admiral Kethvar felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in decades. Uncertainty. In his long career, he had conquered 43 worlds. Every single one had eventually surrendered. Even the ones that initially refused had come around after seeing demonstrations of Imperial power. Perhaps we should demonstrate our capabilities, suggested his tactical officer. A limited strike on one of their colonies or orbital stations. Show them what our weapons can do. Kethvar nodded. Target their moon base. It's large enough to be impressive but not critical to their survival. We'll vaporize half of it and leave the rest as a warning. The attack came without warning. Imperial energy weapons reached across space and struck Luna's main mining complex. The explosions could be seen from Earth with the naked eye. 30,000 people died in seconds. Kethvar waited for the surrender message that he was certain would follow. Instead, he received something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a video message from President Chen, standing in what appeared to be a military command center. Behind her, human soldiers and technicians worked at control stations. The woman looked directly into the camera, and her voice was steady and cold. You just killed 30,000 of our people, she said. We want you to remember that number, because when this is over, we're going to make you pay for every single one of them. She paused, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes that made even Kethvar uncomfortable. You seem to think this is about fear. You believe that if you hurt us enough, we'll submit. But you've made a critical error in your calculations. You've mistaken human survival instinct for human nature. The camera pulled back to show the entire command center. Hundreds of humans working with quiet, determined efficiency. No panic, no desperation. Just cold, focused purpose. We're not afraid of dying, Chen continued. We're afraid of living as slaves. And we've decided that's not going to happen. So here's our counteroffer, Admiral. Leave our system now and we'll let you leave alive. Stay and learn why every other species in the galaxy told you to avoid us. The transmission ended. Admiral Kethvar stood in stunned silence. In his entire military career, no one had ever threatened him. The very idea was absurd. How could a primitive species threaten the most powerful empire in the galaxy? But as he looked at the tactical displays showing Earth's response to the Luna attack, he began to understand that something had gone very wrong with his calculations. Instead of surrender broadcasts, his sensors were picking up massive industrial activity all across the human system. Ships were launching from every human world and asteroid base, not fleeing in terror, but moving with purpose toward unknown destinations. Sir, his intelligence officer reported, we're detecting unusual energy signatures from the human worlds. They appear to be activating some kind of planetary defense systems. What kind of defense systems? Kethvar demanded. We don't know, sir. The energy patterns are unlike anything in our databases. Captain Sarah Martinez floated in zero gravity, checking her equipment one final time. Around her, 11 other humans did the same in the cramped confines of the stealth transport ship. They were about to do something that no military force in the galaxy had ever attempted. Infiltrate a Zephyrian Imperial stronghold. Remember, Martinez whispered into her comm unit, we're not here to fight their army. We're here to take away their ability to feed it. The mission had been planned in secret for weeks. While Admiral Kethvar focused on Earth's obvious military preparations, human intelligence services had been studying a different kind of target. Not Imperial warships or military bases, but something far more vulnerable. The Empire's food supply. Dr. Elena Vasquez had made the discovery that changed everything. While analyzing captured Imperial technology, she found something interesting about Zephyrian biology. They could only digest a very specific type of protein found in genetically modified crops. Without these crops, they would starve within months. It's their greatest strength and their greatest weakness, she had explained to the mission planners. They've been so successful that they've spread across dozens of worlds. But every single one of those worlds depends on the same agricultural systems. If something happens to those crops, the something was currently strapped to Martinez's back in a sealed container. It looked like ordinary soil, but it contained modified bacteria that had taken Earth's best scientists 3 weeks to develop. The bacteria would target the specific genetic markers that made Imperial crops edible to Zephyrians. To every other species in the galaxy, the plants would remain perfectly safe, but to the Empire they would become poisonous. Approaching target, announced the pilot. Agri-World's F7 coming into sensor range. Martinez looked out through the small viewport. F7 was one of 12 agricultural worlds that fed the entire Imperial military. It was beautiful in its own way, with vast golden fields stretching from horizon to horizon. Millions of Zephyrian farmers and automated systems worked constantly to produce food for the Empire's expansion. Remember what General Okafor said? Martinez told her team. We're not just soldiers today, we're exterminators. And we're about to show the Empire what happens when you threaten a species that's really good at biological warfare. The stealth ship landed in a remote area, far from any Imperial settlements. The team moved quickly through the night, using equipment designed to be invisible to Imperial sensors. Their target was the central irrigation system that fed water to thousands of square kilometers of farmland. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The modified bacteria would spread through the water system, infecting crops across the entire continent. Within days, the infection would spread to other agricultural worlds through normal trade and transport. The Empire wouldn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. Biological warfare was banned on Earth for good reasons, Martinez thought as she prepared the delivery system. But the Empire never signed those treaties, and they started this fight. While Martinez's team worked on Zeph-7, similar operations were taking place across Imperial space. Humans had spent months infiltrating the Empire's territory, posing as refugees or traitors. Now they were all activating at once, striking at infrastructure the Empire had never thought to defend. On the Imperial capital world, Master Sergeant James Park was implementing a very different kind of attack. He wasn't targeting crops or factories. He was targeting something much more dangerous: information. Park had been working undercover as a maintenance technician in the Imperial Communications Center for 6 weeks. The Zephyrians never suspected that the quiet alien who fixed their computers was actually a former cyber warfare specialist from Earth's most elite military unit. Humans have been breaking encryption for fun since before we had faster-than-light travel, he muttered as his fingers flew across alien keyboards. These guys are about to learn why you never give hackers a challenge. The Imperial communication network was incredibly sophisticated, but it had a fatal flaw. It was designed to be unbreakable from the outside. The engineers never considered the possibility that someone might attack it from within. Park's virus was a masterpiece of malicious code. It didn't just steal information or crash systems. Instead, it subtly altered communications across the entire Imperial network. Orders were changed by single words that completely reversed their meaning. Intelligence reports were modified to make loyal colonies appear to be in rebellion. Supply requisitions were scrambled, sending winter clothing to desert worlds and heavy weapons to agricultural settlements. The beauty of this approach, Park thought as he watched his virus spread through Imperial networks, is that they'll do most of our work for us. Nothing destroys an empire faster than not being able to trust its own information. Back on Earth, the war room had been transformed into something that looked more like a research laboratory than a military command center. General Okafor stood before a massive holographic display showing the entire galaxy. Red dots marked Imperial worlds, while blue dots showed human operations in progress. Status. Report, she ordered. Agricultural strike teams have successfully deployed on 9 of 12 Imperial food production worlds, reported Colonel Martinez, Sarah's father and head of biological warfare operations. We should see effects within 72 hours. Communications disruption is ahead of schedule, added Major Chen, Park's handler. Imperial fleet coordination has degraded by 30% in the last 6 hours. They're starting to fire on their own ships. Excellent, Okafor nodded. What about our allies? This was the part of the plan that even surprised Earth's leaders. Humans hadn't just attacked the Empire directly. They had also reached out to every species the Empire had conquered over the past 3 centuries. The message was simple. The Empire is weakening, and now is your chance for revenge. The response had been overwhelming. Species that had been enslaved for generations suddenly found themselves with weapons, intelligence, and most importantly, hope. The Score, whose homeworld had been destroyed as an example to others, emerged from hiding in asteroid belts and began attacking Imperial supply lines. The aquatic Nethril used their knowledge of Imperial underwater facilities to sabotage mining operations. Even species that had seemed completely broken began to fight back. The Hivari have seized control of the Kepler 442 shipyards, reported the intelligence officer. They're using Imperial facilities to build weapons for themselves. The Kellan survivors have taken 3 Imperial garrison worlds, added another officer. They're not taking prisoners, Okafor smiled grimly. This is exactly what we hoped would happen. The Empire built their power on fear and oppression. But when you rule through fear, you create a lot of enemies, and we just gave all those enemies the opportunity to settle old scores. The transformation was happening faster than anyone had predicted. For 3 centuries, the Zephyrian Empire had maintained control through overwhelming military superiority, but their military depended on logistics, communication, and supply lines that stretched across 12 star systems. Humans had taught the galaxy how to attack those weak points. Admiral Kethvar was beginning to understand the scope of the disaster unfolding around him. His fleet was still the most powerful military force in the galaxy, but it was becoming increasingly irrelevant. You couldn't use battleships to stop crop diseases or computer viruses. Sir, his intelligence officer reported with barely controlled panic, we're receiving reports of uprising on 17 Imperial worlds. Our communication with the outer systems has been completely cut off. And our food supplies. Something is wrong with our food supplies. What do you mean wrong? Kethvar demanded. The crops on our agricultural worlds are dying, sir. All of them. Simultaneously. Our xenobiologists say it's some kind of engineered plague that specifically targets our food crops. Kethvar felt his confidence beginning to crack. This wasn't how wars were supposed to work. Enemies were supposed to meet in space, fight honorable battles with ships and weapons, and the stronger side was supposed to win. They weren't supposed to sneak around poisoning food and spreading computer viruses. And, sir, the officer continued reluctantly, we're getting reports that our own ships are attacking each other. Something has corrupted our communication systems. Half our fleet commanders think they're receiving orders to suppress rebellions that don't exist. This is impossible, Kethvar said. How can a primitive species cause this much damage? They barely have space travel. But as he looked at the tactical displays showing chaos spreading across his empire, he began to understand that he had made a fundamental error. He had assumed that because humans had less advanced technology, they were less dangerous. He had forgotten to consider what they might be more advanced at. Sir, his tactical officer said quietly, perhaps we should consider negotiating with the humans. If we can reach some kind of agreement, the Empire does not negotiate with primitives, Kethvar snapped. But even as he said it, he could see the doubt in his officer's eyes. They were beginning to realize what he was only starting to understand. They weren't fighting primitives anymore. They were fighting humans. And humans, as the Empire was learning, approached warfare very differently than any other species in the galaxy. They didn't just try to defeat their enemies. They tried to destroy everything. Their Admiral Kethvar stood in his command center, watching his empire collapse in real time. The holographic display that once showed the orderly expansion of Imperial territory now looked like a medical chart of a dying patient. Red warning lights blinked across dozens of star systems. Report, he ordered, though he dreaded the answer. Commander Vexahai, his intelligence chief, approached with 4 data tablets. His usually perfect uniform looked rumpled and his 4 eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Sir, the situation continues to deteriorate. We've lost communication with 7 Outer Rim colonies. The agricultural crisis has spread to all 12 food production worlds. And the rebellions?" Vexhai hesitated, then activated the holographic display. Instead of the familiar blue-green worlds of the Empire, the map now showed dozens of red zones marked as hostile or unknown status. "The Score have taken their entire home system back," Vexhai continued. "They're using captured Imperial ships to attack our supply convoys. The Nethril have flooded the underwater mining facilities on Aqua 3, drowning over 10,000 Imperial workers. And the Hivari." The display zoomed in on a cluster of industrial worlds. "They've seized the entire Kepler 442 manufacturing complex. They're not just building weapons for themselves anymore, sir. They're arming other rebel species." Kethavar felt something he had never experienced before. Genuine fear. Not fear of death in battle, which was honorable, but fear of total failure. The empire he had spent his life serving was falling apart, and he couldn't understand how it was happening so fast. "What about the humans?" he asked. "Surely their primitive fleet can't be responsible for all of this." "That's the problem, sir," Vexhai replied grimly. "We can barely find their fleet. Our sensors detect small human ships throughout Imperial space, but they're not engaging in traditional warfare. They appear to be coordinating. Coordinating what?" Dr. Elena Vasquez had the answer to that question, though Kethavar would never get to ask her directly. She was currently aboard a captured Imperial research vessel, analyzing the psychological profiles the Empire had compiled on their subject species. "This is fascinating," she told her research team via encrypted communication. "The Zephyrians have detailed studies on every species they've conquered, but they completely misunderstood what they were looking at." She pulled up a file labeled Subjugated Species Psychological Profiles. The data was incredibly detailed, showing fear responses, submission patterns, and prediction models for each conquered race. "Look at this." Vasquez pointed to a chart showing Score behavior patterns. The Empire classified them as broken after their homeworld was destroyed. They assumed the survivors would never fight back because they seemed to accept Imperial rule without resistance. "But that wasn't acceptance," observed Lieutenant Commander Torres, her second in command. "That was planning." "Exactly," Vasquez nodded. The Score weren't broken. They were waiting. Same with the Nethril, the Hivari, and all the others. The Empire mistook survival strategy for submission. She pulled up another file, this one showing communication patterns between conquered worlds. The Empire knew that subjugated species stayed in contact with each other, but they assumed it was just cultural exchange. They never realized it was intelligence sharing. What the Empire had failed to understand was that oppressed peoples talk to each other. For 3 centuries, every species under Imperial rule had been secretly sharing information about Imperial tactics, weaknesses, and failures. When humans finally gave them the tools and coordination to fight back, they already knew exactly how to do maximum damage. The rebellion wasn't random chaos. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been planned for generations. On the aquatic world of Nethril Prime, the underwater cities that the Empire thought had been drained were actually hidden beneath artificially created ice sheets. Thousands of Nethril engineers had spent decades modifying Imperial equipment to work underwater, then used that same equipment to flood Imperial mining operations across 3 star systems. In the Hivari collective worlds, the insectoid engineers who had been forced to build Imperial warships had secretly introduced flaws into every design. Now those flaws were being activated remotely, causing Imperial ships to suffer critical failures during combat. Even species that seemed completely defeated were proving dangerous. The Kellen, whose homeworld had been bombarded into radioactive waste, had spent generations living in deep space habitats. They knew how to survive in the most hostile environments in the galaxy. Now they were using that knowledge to attack Imperial facilities in places the Empire thought were impossible to reach. "Sir," Vexhai reported to Admiral Kethavar, "we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. It's a message from their president." President Chen appeared on the main screen, but she wasn't in the military command center this time. She was standing in what looked like a garden, with Earth's blue sky visible in the background. She looked calm, almost peaceful. "Admiral Kethavar," she began, "I hope you're beginning to understand your situation. You came to our system expecting to find another species willing to trade freedom for survival. Instead, you found humans. The camera pulled back to show the garden more clearly. It was beautiful, with flowering trees and children playing in the distance. It looked nothing like a military installation. You made several errors in your calculations, Chen continued. First, you assumed that technological superiority equals military superiority. Second, you assumed that fear would make us submit. Third, and most importantly, you assumed that we would fight alone. The image changed to show a star map of the galaxy. But this wasn't the Empire's map showing conquered territories. This was a human map showing allied worlds, trade routes, and communication networks that the Empire had never known existed. What you're seeing now isn't a human victory, Chen explained. It's a galactic uprising. We didn't conquer the Empire. We just taught everyone else how to break the chains you put on them. Admiral Kethvar stared at the map in horror. The network of alliances and communication channels showed that human influence had spread far beyond what Imperial intelligence had detected. Dozens of species were now working together in ways the Empire had never imagined possible. The rebellion you're facing isn't driven by human weapons or human ships, Chen continued. It's driven by human ideas. The idea that no species has the right to rule another. The idea that freedom is worth fighting for. The idea that even the most powerful empire can be brought down if enough people decide they've had enough. The transmission ended, but its impact was immediate. Across the Imperial fleet, officers and crew members began to understand that they weren't just facing a military defeat. They were facing the complete collapse of their worldview. The Empire had been built on the belief that strength meant the right to rule. That superior technology justified conquest. That fear could maintain order across the galaxy. But humans had introduced a different set of ideas, and those ideas were proving more powerful than any weapon. Sir, the communications officer reported nervously, we're receiving surrender offers from 12 Imperial garrison worlds. Their commanders say they can't maintain order against the local populations. Surrender offers? Kethvar couldn't believe what he was hearing. Imperial forces don't surrender to primitives. They're not surrendering to primitives, sir, Vexhai said quietly. They're surrendering to their own populations. The local species on those worlds have taken control. They're offering safe passage to Imperial personnel in exchange for complete withdrawal. This was something that had never happened in Imperial history. The Empire had always maintained control through overwhelming force and careful psychological manipulation. But when populations lost their fear and gained hope, they became unstoppable. On Imperial world after Imperial world, the same pattern was repeating. Local populations would rise up, often led by species that had been considered completely subjugated. They would seize control of Imperial facilities, free enslaved populations, and establish their own governments. Then they would politely but firmly ask Imperial personnel to leave. Most Imperial commanders, faced with the choice between fighting entire planetary populations or accepting safe passage home, chose to leave. The Empire was losing worlds not through military conquest, but through mass rejection of Imperial authority. What are our options? Kethvar asked his staff. We could try to retake the rebel worlds one by one, suggested the tactical officer. If we concentrate our fleet, with what supplies? Interrupted the logistics coordinator. Our food production is gone. Our communication network is compromised. Half our fleet is fighting the other half because they can't tell which orders are real. We could try to negotiate. The Empire does not negotiate, Kethvar snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth was becoming clear to everyone in the command center. The Empire was dying and no one knew how to save it. The humans had found a way to turn the Empire's greatest strength, its vast size and diverse population, into its greatest weakness. Dr. Vasquez had been... Colonel Marcus Reed watched the evacuation ships lift off from Zephyros Prime, the Imperial capital world. Each ship carried thousands of former slaves and forced laborers, species that had been brought to the capital to build monuments to Imperial power. Now they were free, heading to new homes among the liberated worlds. Last transport is away, sir, reported Lieutenant Yamamoto. That's everyone who wanted to leave. Reed nodded, checking his chronometer. In 12 hours, the planet would be uninhabitable for Zephyrians. Not because of bombs or weapons, but because humans had quietly dismantled every piece of technology that made the world suitable for Imperial life. It's almost beautiful, Reed said, looking out over the empty Imperial capital. The massive crystal towers still gleamed in the alien sun, but they were hollow now. No lights shone in the windows. No vehicles moved through the streets. The city looked like a fossil of a civilization that had simply walked away. The operation had taken 6 months of careful planning. Reed's engineering teams had worked with freed slave populations to map every critical system on the planet. Atmospheric processors, gravitational stabilizers, water purification plants, power generators, all the invisible technology that kept an advanced civilization running. The locals knew every weakness, Reed remembered thinking during the planning phase. 300 years of forced labor, and they knew exactly which systems were essential and which were redundant. The dismantling had been surgical. Nothing was destroyed violently. Instead, critical components were simply removed. Power sources were disconnected and backup systems were disabled. To outside observers, everything looked normal. But within days, the planet would become uninhabitable for its Imperial masters. "Sir," Yamamoto said, "we're receiving a message from Admiral Kethvar. He's demanding to speak with you." Reed activated the communication system. Admiral Kethvar appeared on the screen, and Reed was shocked by how much the Imperial commander had changed. The confident, arrogant officer who had threatened Earth was gone. In his place was a being who looked exhausted and desperate. "Human commander," Kethvar said, "I demand to know what you have done to our capital world." "We haven't done anything to your world, Admiral," Reed replied calmly. "We've simply given its people the choice to leave." "What people?" "There are no people left. You've evacuated the entire planet." "We evacuated everyone who wanted to leave," Reed corrected. "You're welcome to return to your capital anytime you want. But I should warn you that life support systems will begin failing in about 11 hours. Kethvar's 4 eyes widened in understanding. "You sabotaged our infrastructure." "We liberated your infrastructure," Reed said. "Every machine on that planet was built by slave labor. Now those slaves have taken back their work. If you want to live on Zephyros Prime, you'll have to build your own life support systems." The transmission cut off abruptly. Reed could imagine Kethvar's rage, but he felt no sympathy. The Empire had built its capital using the forced labor of a dozen species. Now those same species had taken back everything they had been forced to create. Reed's operation was being repeated across the galaxy. Human engineering teams, working with local populations, were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that kept Imperial worlds habitable for their conquerors. It was elegant, efficient, and completely devastating. On the industrial world of Forge 7, Hivari engineers who had been forced to build Imperial weapons for centuries simply stopped working. Without maintenance, the massive factories that produced starship components began breaking down. Within weeks, the Empire's ability to build new ships had virtually disappeared. On the mining world of Extract 12, Nethril workers who had been forced to work in underwater facilities opened the sea gates and let the ocean reclaim the mines. Billions of tons of rare metals that the Empire depended on were now buried under kilometers of water. The pattern was the same everywhere. The Empire had become completely dependent on the labor of conquered species. When those species decided to stop working for their oppressors, Imperial civilization simply ground to a halt. General Patricia Okafor watched the reports streaming in from across the galaxy. The war room on Earth had been transformed into a coordination center for the largest refugee operation in galactic history. Millions of beings were being relocated from Imperial worlds to newly liberated planets. "Status report," she requested. "Operation Exodus is proceeding ahead of schedule," reported Captain Singh, the logistics coordinator. "We've successfully evacuated 17 Imperial worlds. Local populations have taken control of infrastructure on 23 additional systems." "What about Imperial military response?" "Minimal," Singh replied with a slight smile. "Most Imperial forces are either defecting or requesting safe passage to the Outer Rim. Admiral Kethvar's fleet has lost 60% of its strength to desertion." Okafor nodded. This was exactly what human strategists had predicted. The Empire's military was entirely composed of conquered species led by Zephyrian officers. When those conquered species realized they could simply walk away, most of them did. And the Zephyrians themselves? "That's where it gets interesting," Singh said. "We're receiving requests for asylum from Zephyrian civilians on a dozen worlds. It seems many of them never supported the Empire either. This had been one of the most surprising developments of the war. As Imperial authority collapsed, it became clear that even many Zephyrians had been trapped by their own system. Young Zephyrians who had never wanted to be part of an empire based on conquest were now asking for protection from human forces. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent months studying captured Imperial archives, and her findings had changed human understanding of their enemy entirely. The Empire wasn't a species-wide choice, she explained in her latest report. It was a military dictatorship that controlled Zephyrian society as completely as it controlled conquered worlds. Most Zephyrians never had any more choice about being part of the Empire than the species they conquered. This revelation had led to one of the most difficult decisions of the war. What should be done with ordinary Zephyrian civilians who had never been soldiers or administrators? President Chen had made the call personally. "We're not fighting the Zephyrian people," she announced. "We're fighting the Imperial system. Any Zephyrian who wants to live peacefully with other species is welcome to do so." The offer had created chaos within what remained of Imperial territory. Thousands of Zephyrian families were abandoning Imperial worlds and seeking refuge among the liberated systems. They brought with them technical knowledge, cultural insights, and most importantly, detailed information about Imperial operations. Admiral Kethvar watched his empire die one world at a time. The holographic displays in his command center now showed mostly empty space where Imperial territory used to be. His fleet, once the most powerful military force in the galaxy, was down to less than 30 ships. Most of his officers had either defected or requested transfer to refugee protection duties. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. It's their president again." Chen appeared on the screen, but this time she wasn't alone. Standing beside her were representatives from dozens of species: Skor, Nethril, Hivari, and others that Kethvar recognized as former Imperial subjects. But there were also beings he didn't recognize, species that had apparently joined the Alliance voluntarily. "Admiral Kethvar," Chen began, "this is my final offer. Surrender your remaining ships and you and your crew will be granted safe passage to any world that will accept you. Continue fighting and you'll face the combined fleets of every free species in the galaxy." The camera pulled back to show a massive space station surrounded by hundreds of ships. But these weren't just human vessels. The fleet contained ships from every major species in the galaxy, all working together under a unified command. "The war is over, Admiral," Chen continued. "Your empire is gone. Your worlds have been liberated. Your infrastructure has been dismantled. The only question now is whether you want to join the rest of us in building something better, or whether you want to die defending something that no longer exists." Kethvar looked around his command center. His remaining officers stared at the screen with expressions ranging from despair to resignation. They all understood what they were seeing. The Empire hadn't just been defeated militarily. It had been rejected by its own subjects and abandoned by its own people. "What are you offering?" Kethvar asked quietly. "Peace," Chen replied. "A chance to live without conquest, without oppression, without the constant need to prove your superiority over other species. Join the Galactic Federation as equals, or continue fighting as the last remnant of a failed empire." For the first time in the war, Kethvar felt something approaching hope. Not hope for victory, that was clearly impossible now, but hope for survival, for a future that didn't involve endless war and domination. "And if we refuse?" Chen's expression hardened slightly. "Then you'll learn why every species in the galaxy is grateful that humans decided to be liberators instead of conquerors." The threat was subtle, but clear. Humanity had demonstrated the ability to completely dismantle advanced civilizations without firing a shot. If they chose to turn that capability toward destruction instead of liberation, even the Imperial fleet wouldn't survive. "I need time to consider," Kethvar said. "You have 24 how 6 months after Earth said no." Admiral Kethvar stood on the observation deck of Refuge Station, watching ships from a dozen different species dock at the massive orbital facility. He wore civilian clothes now, a simple gray jumpsuit that marked him as a refugee rather than a military commander. The uniform that had once symbolized Imperial authority was gone forever. "Strange, isn't it?" said a voice behind him. Kethvar turned to see Dr. Elena Vasquez approaching with 2 cups of coffee, a human beverage that had become popular throughout the former Imperial territories. She offered him one and he accepted it gratefully. "What's strange?" he asked. "How peaceful everything looks," Vasquez said, gesturing toward the docking bays. 6 months ago, most of these species were shooting at each other. Now they're working together to build refugee settlements. Kethvar sipped his coffee and considered her words. She was right, of course. The sight before them would have been impossible under Imperial rule. Score ships docked next to Nethril transports. Hivari engineers worked alongside human technicians. Former enemies had become allies in the massive undertaking of rebuilding a galaxy. I still don't understand how you did it, Kethvar admitted. Your technology was inferior. Your fleet was smaller. By every measure I was taught to use, the Empire should have won. Vasquez smiled. That's because you were using the wrong measures. You were fighting a war, but we were ending a system. She activated a holographic display that showed the current state of the galaxy. Instead of the rigid territorial boundaries of the old empire, the map showed a complex network of independent worlds connected by trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and cultural exchanges. Look at this. Vasquez pointed to a cluster of agricultural worlds. These used to be imperial food production facilities worked by slave labor. Now they're independent farming cooperatives that sell their crops to anyone who wants them. Production is actually higher than it was under imperial management. The display shifted to show industrial systems. The Hivari are still building ships, but now they're building them for everyone. Exploration vessels, scientific research ships, even recreational spacecraft. They're making more money and having more fun than they ever did building imperial warships. Kethvar studied the data with professional interest. As someone trained in imperial logistics, he could see the efficiency of the new system. Without the overhead of military occupation and resource extraction, the former imperial worlds were becoming more prosperous than they had ever been. What about security? He asked. Without central authority, how do you prevent conflicts between species? That was actually the easy part, Vasquez replied. We created the Galactic Mediation Council. When disputes arise, all parties agree to binding arbitration rather than war. It's cheaper, faster, and nobody has to die. And everyone agrees to this. Everyone agrees because everyone helped create it, Vasquez explained. The rules weren't imposed by conquerors. They were negotiated by equals. That makes all the difference. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the station's communication system. Admiral Kethvar, please report to Conference Room 7. Admiral Kethvar to Conference Room 7. Kethvar felt a familiar anxiety. Even though he was no longer a military officer, being summoned to meetings still made him nervous. During the Empire's collapse, such summons had usually meant more bad news about losing territory or ships defecting. Relax, Vasquez said, noticing his expression. It's probably good news. They walked together through the station's corridors, passing beings from dozens of different species. What struck Kethvar most was how normal it all seemed. There were no armed guards, no racial segregation, no signs of tension. It was as if the galaxy had simply moved on from 3 centuries of imperial rule. Conference Room 7 contained a surprise. Instead of human officials or military commanders, Kethvar found himself facing a panel of his own former subjects, a score engineer, a Nethril scientist, and a Hivari architect. They stood as he entered, showing him a respect he hadn't expected. Admiral, the score engineer said, we have a proposition for you. I'm not an admiral anymore, Kethvar replied. I'm just a refugee. You're someone with extensive knowledge of imperial infrastructure, the Nethril scientist corrected, and we need that knowledge. The Hivari architect activated a holographic display showing Zephyros Prime, the former imperial capital. We want to restore the planet, but we need help understanding how the imperial systems worked. Many of the automated systems are still functional, but we can't access them without imperial authorization codes. Kethvar stared at the display. The world looked exactly as he remembered it, but he knew it was uninhabitable now. The life support systems his engineers had built were gone, dismantled by the very people who had been forced to construct them. You want me to help you rebuild the world I once ruled? He asked. We want you to help us build something better, the score engineer said. A world where all species can live together as equals. The new Zephyros will be a multicultural center for scientific research and cultural exchange, the Hivari architect explained. We have funding from 12 different species and support from the Galactic Council, but we need someone who understands imperial technology to help us adapt it for peaceful purposes. Kethvar was quiet for a long moment. The offer was generous, more generous than he had any right to expect from people he had once helped oppress. But it also represented something he wasn't sure he was ready for. A chance at redemption. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Why not just study Imperial technical manuals?" "Because you're not just a technician," the Nethril scientist said. "You're someone who understands how the Empire actually worked. The fear, the control systems, the psychological manipulation. We need that knowledge to make sure we never build anything like it again." The conversation continued for 2 hours. By the end, Kethvar had agreed to join the Zephyros Restoration Project as a historical consultant and systems analyst. It wasn't a military command, but it was a chance to use his knowledge for construction instead of conquest. As he left the meeting, Kethvar found Vasquez waiting in the corridor. "How did it go?" she asked. "They offered me a job," he said, still somewhat stunned. "They want me to help rebuild the world I used to rule. Are you going to take it?" Kethvar thought about the question. 6 months ago, he had been the second most powerful being in the galaxy, commanding fleets that could destroy solar systems. Now he was a refugee being offered a chance to help build a research station. By any objective measure, it was a dramatic fall from power. But as he looked around the station, seeing beings from dozens of species working together peacefully, he realized that maybe power had been the wrong goal all along. "Yes," he said, "I think I am." 3 years later, Kethvar stood in the same observation lounge on Refuge Station, but everything had changed. The station itself had grown massively, becoming a major hub for trade and diplomacy. Ships from hundreds of worlds docked there daily, representing the incredible diversity of the new Galactic Federation. Dr. Vasquez joined him again, as had become their custom during his visits to the station. She was older now, with gray hair and lines around her eyes, but she looked happier than he had ever seen her during the war. "How's the project going?" she asked. "Better than we hoped," Kethvar replied. "New Zephyros opens next month. We'll have research facilities for 15 different species, plus cultural centers, art galleries, and the largest library in the galaxy." "And the old Imperial archives?" "Open to everyone," Kethvar said. "We've digitized everything and made it available for historical research. People need to understand how the Empire worked so they can recognize the warning signs if anyone tries to build something similar." Vasquez nodded approvingly. "And what about you? Any regrets about leaving military service?" Kethvar considered the question. "I regret the years I spent enforcing oppression," he said finally. "But I don't regret leaving that life behind. Building something is much more satisfying than destroying it." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the ships come and go. Representatives from the former Imperial worlds, traders from independent systems, scientists from research institutes, and tourists from dozens of species. It was everything the Empire could have been if it had chosen cooperation over conquest. "There's something I've always wanted to ask you," Vasquez said. "During the war, did you ever really believe the Empire would win?" Kethvar thought back to those desperate months when his empire had crumbled around him. "At first, yes. I couldn't imagine any other outcome. But looking back, I think the Empire was doomed from the moment it decided that strength gave it the right to rule others." "Why?" "Because ruling through fear requires everyone to stay afraid forever," Kethvar explained. "But fear is exhausting. Eventually, people get tired of being afraid and start looking for alternatives. When humans showed the galaxy that the Empire could be resisted, that fear turned into hope, and hope is much more powerful than fear." A new ship was approaching the station, a sleek vessel he didn't recognize. According to the docking manifest,